Welcome to the Select Star Podcast, your resource for innovative technology, developer topics, and more. Here's your host, Margo McCabe from the HarperDB team.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Select Star Podcast hosted by HarperDB. Thanks again for tuning in. Today, we are speaking with a software engineering manager at PayPal, and we're going to be talking a bit about SDKs and a couple other topics that I'm excited to jump into. So thank you, Ghanshyam for joining us.
Thank you, Margo. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about, the stuff that I've been working on.
Awesome. And where are you calling in from today?
I am actually from the Bay Area, so I live close to the PayPal headquarters near San Jose.
Okay. Awesome. That's a great area. I haven't been out in a couple years. I usually try to visit at least once every year, every other year, but I've been slacking.
Yeah, it's been the weather's been actually great lately. So
Awesome.
that's been great.
That's what they say. It's the late summer there.
Oh yeah, yes.
So before we jump into it, would love to hear just a bit about you, your background, kind of your journey in tech.
Yeah, sure. So my background is I'm a computer science major. I did my master's in computer science from Northeastern University in Boston. Um, and I've been, in software engineering for like the past decade. Um, and so back in like 2010, um, I started doing some mobile development. Android was kind of pretty new and upcoming at that point, and I was helping an NGO, write an app in Android, and that's how I kind of got introduced to Intuit when they were hiring a few mobile engineers from Mint.com, and I got hired as an intern at Mint.com, for on their Android app. And that's how I got into mobile engineering, and I've been, kind of doing mobile engineering since then. Um, I worked at Intuit after graduating. They hired me back full time, and so I was working, as an Android developer for Mint. That was actually really cool because it was a very widely used app, and it had a lot of like UI elements to it. I learned a lot about just building delightful UI experiences for our users. And that just really, got me more interested in mobile development. So after Intuit, I worked at a startup where we had to build an app in Android from scratch. So that was a fun experience as well. And then after that, I kind of got into SDK development. I worked at DocuSign, where we built an Android SDK for DocuSign from scratch. And so that was also fun because I got to use all the latest and greatest technology to build, an SDK from scratch. And oftentimes when you have these large code bases, it's legacy code. But when you're building something new, you really got to like up your game because you can now it's just a blank slate for you where you can pick and choose what you want. So that was a great experience for me as well. And we built the V1 of the Android SDK that we shipped. And then I joined PayPal, where currently I'm working on shipping the native checkout SDKs. So within PayPal, checkout is a big organization, and that's a big part of like what PayPal does. And my team here comprises of Android and iOS engineers, and we ship the native checkout SDKs. And so an SDK basically is an embeddable artifact that our merchants, they use for their buyers who have PayPal to go through a native PayPal checkout experience. So so I guess it's been a decade, and I've been really working closely with mobile technologies on both Android and iOS. I've kind of seen it, come a long way from what it was in 2010 to like what it is today. And it's been a really fun and exciting journey.
That's awesome. Wow, thanks for the background. It sounds like you've had, I guess, a bit of a diverse experience to kind of get to where you are today. And one thing I was I was curious about is what the experience is like. You said you were at a startup for a period of time, and then other than that, it sounds like with DocuSign and PayPal, you've been at larger companies. What's it like sort of having that experience of both? Do you find that you like working with larger teams better, or it's kind of just more, what the actual projects are that you're working on that's of interest?
Yeah, it's a totally different experience, even I guess like between PayPal and DocuSign, where DocuSign, even though it was kind of a larger company, the teams were kind of small and had uh, defined charters. At PayPal, it's a totally different ball game where it's a really big company, so you really have to work across teams to ship any product out. And so the now at being at PayPal, you kind of get a hang of how to deal with cross-team collaboration. So I feel like now I do have a hang of it, but it is challenging at first, especially when you come from small companies, to have so many moving parts in just being able to get your day-to-day job done. So I'd say I think the best way to kind of navigate an organizational complexity like this is to make sure that your like written and oral communication skills are at point, and you're able to like explain what needs to be done. You're able to explain what's happening with your code, and I think if you get to like master that skill of bringing everyone on the same page, then like whether it's working at a startup or working at a big company, you kind of really get that edge. So I'd say like that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a good way to look at it. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's more just what type of communication works for you, and do you like wearing a lot of hats and having more process in place. Like it's, as you said, it can just be very different even from organization to organization. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's jump into SDKs. I know you just gave a brief kind of overview on what SDKs are in case folks listening aren't familiar. I'm also curious of sort of how SDKs are developed, what companies are building them, and who are the customers, jumping into all that. And it's interesting because even in the space that I'm in, like we have different SDKs built around using HarperDB, and we've had different just folks from the community sometimes create them for fun. We've also hired out some individual like contributors to create specific ones, but it comes down to with tools like ours where it's not necessarily like a requirement to use the tool. It's more of a nice to have that can make it a little easier. So I'm curious from the standpoint where you're building them and where you're using them, is it a requirement or is it more of like a nice to have, and kind of why they're so important?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I think the the need to kind of build an SDK comes when your company or your product is selling a solution, whether it be to the enterprise customers that you have, or whether it be to like the end users who are using your product. So thinking about maybe like DocuSign, for example, the goal of having an SDK for DocuSign was because for our because DocuSign is a solution that allows you to like sign documents. And eventually what we want is that our clients who use DocuSign, so like let's say, if there's like a big phone company that is our client. And so whenever you go to like get a new line or a new device, you have to sign a contract. And these apps these days, allow you to do everything from within the mobile app. And so really the use case that kind of defines why to have an SDK is you want a seamless flow for the end user. So if I am like on my phone and I want to buy a new phone, I want to really, I'm on this app that allows me to buy a new phone, and I have to sign a contract. Why like launch the web to load a document on the web and then sign and then come back into the app? Or like why app switch into another app to just sign a document? Why not just have everything completed in the app that you start the process from? So that really kind of defines why there is a need for an SDK, is for like the end clients or the end like users to have a very seamless experience. That was the case for DocuSign, kind of also the case for PayPal. If I'm like buying on a shopping app, I really don't want to open like a web view, which is like clunky, to just select, a card that I want to pay with. Why not just have a really seamless experience? And so that's why it becomes important that, US DocuSign or US PayPal are living within your clients. Um, so like in this case, like the shopping app or that, that the phone app that you're living in, um, you don't really leave that app to finish the experience. And that's the major use case on the companies who are building SDKs, is if you can have a white label product that can sit, outside of your company property. So for example, when we ship the SDK with PayPal, our SDK sits in, like the shopping apps or like a booking app or travel booking app. And so it's really a third party um, app that our SDK is sitting in. And so uh, if you can encapsulate what you do best and you can ship it out so that others who are your clients can use that in the app, I think that's the use case where the companies who are building these SDKs are building them. And it doesn't have to be a complete solution. I know, for example, like there are some apps, if they'll build a really good image loading system to, like, for example, Airbnb, right? They have a lot of images that they show in the app, and they kind of abstract because they did it really well. And you look at the images, there's no latency, you can swipe through them. So they really did like spend a lot of effort. And what they did is they abstracted the image loading into an SDK, and then they made that open source. So if I, as an app, have to use any image loading stuff, I can just use the SDK that Airbnb built. So it's really just encapsulating what you do, in parts or as a whole, into an SDK that you can like ship out in other apps. I think those are the use cases to build the SDK, and the companies who are using it, are like these consumer apps on the phones, especially where they want the end buyers to have a quick, seamless experience in the entire like process. And so like for shopping, for example, there are just so many things involved in shopping, right? Like you create a cart, you kind of add items, and then once they do that, you really want your buyers to pay seamlessly. You don't want your buyers to like feel that friction at the end step of like payments when it comes up, because then you lose that user. And so those are the companies who are looking for these solutions that they can embed in their apps. So that's really kind of the basis of SDK development from like where I understand it.
Okay, got it. That's a really helpful overview. Thank you. So kind of going back to what you touched on, who are then the companies that are building these SDKs? Like, are sometimes people developing, do you think that it's more common for teams to be developing them internally, or are people outsourcing it to individuals or outsourcing it to companies, or does it kind of depend on like what the needs are? Are there any recommendations around that?
Yeah, it's actually really depends on the needs. It took PayPal a really long time, for example, to kind of invest in a mobile SDK. And then, once the company, if they see the value, they'll start investing in it. And then I think I've also seen cases where, like you said, like if there's an open community, people will kind of build out an SDK for you. So we've seen that happening as well, where, some of the products that people are really passionate about, and we have like a good online community about, they will start building these SDKs. And that's mainly because, you want to build it once and be able to use it over and over again, versus having to like build it in every app, for example. So it's, if your use case, if you are a company and if you think like, hey, you can put this piece of code, you can write it once and you can put it in like 10 different apps out there, then that becomes a use case to build an SDK.
Right. That makes sense. That's interesting. And so how then is SDK development different from app development?
Yeah, I think I've done both. I've done the app development and then I've been doing SDK. And I think you really, as a developer, if you are a mobile developer, and you're listening to this, I think you need a slight mental shift. Just because, when you're doing an app development, you kind of own the entire app lifecycle. Like you own when the app is invoked, and then you have the app packaged and bundled like you like it. But when you're doing an SDK development, you come into the picture in some flows in that app, if not all. And then you come in at a point where, there's usually a point which is user interactable when your SDK comes into picture. So you really kind of lose that freedom of being able to, use third-party libraries, for example, like you as an SDK might need, another SDK that does a job really well. And if you want to use it, you have to make sure that you are cognizant of, for example, like size not increasing. Because if you're an app and you embed an SDK, you're making that call because you own the app. But when you're an SDK, you can't really just add stuff and add features to your SDK without thinking about the size. Because the more of the size that you occupy, the apps are going to have to face that brunt of like an increased app size, which means that the users who download your client's app are going to have to like download, like if they're downloading on like phone network, they have to pay more. So all of those considerations come into the picture when you are building an SDK and you don't own the app. There are other concerns like security, for example, that you have to keep in mind. Just because you don't own the app, maybe your SDK has some proprietary code in it. You want to make sure that you're protecting that code because not all apps out there are going to be, like good apps, right? There are going to be malicious apps that will try to like attack your SDK, that will try to get the information from the SDK, which might be sensitive. So you have to make sure that you are protecting yourself against bad actors. So when you're developing an SDK, you cannot assume good intent. You cannot assume that all of the integrations are going to be good integrations. So you have to keep that in mind when building an SDK. That's like another important point. And then I guess like lastly, the other important point when or I guess like the difference between an SDK development and an app development is you there is a risk of there's a lot of resources that you use in an SDK that might also be used by the app, for example. So there's a risk of overriding the app overriding, your SDK resources. So like, for example, if you use a name of something like logo. So if you just name your logo that you show in the SDK as just logo, it's possible that the app also names the resource logo, and your SDK experience will get overridden by the app logo experience. So you have to make sure that you are naming things which are pretty unique to your SDK to reduce the risk of override. There are other things that come into picture like permissions. So if you use these apps on Android and iOS, they will ask for permissions like showing you a notification. They'll ask you permissions for autofilling the SMS on Android, and they'll ask you permissions for knowing the location of the device. So if your SDK is asking for any of these permissions, it's actually attributed to the app in the Play Store and App Store. So you really have to think through those flows and make sure that you have documentation around, hey, why are you asking for a location permission? Because for the end user, the shopping app will be asking for the permission for location. Even though it's your SDK that owns that flow, it seems to the user that, hey, why is this app asking me permission? So you have to be mindful of just the differences between an SDK and an app development, and the different ways that it can bubble up, to make sure that the effort is really minimal for your client apps to integrate with your SDK, and that you are not introducing any bugs that are causing issues outside of your flow, but in the app that your client owns. So I think like those are the main differences between SDK and app development. There are much more, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I think like these are kind of the major ones to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. There's some really good reminders in there in terms of do's and don'ts when it comes to SDK development. So I think those are all really helpful tips, especially for folks listening. If you're new to it, or just wondering how to get into SDK development. It also sounds like there's some overlap. Like while there is some overlap between SDK and app development, there's certainly things to keep in mind of why they're different, but it sounds like it's maybe a bit of a natural crossover of if someone's coming from being an app developer, like you mentioned that you have some app development experience, that it can help if you're transitioning over to SDKs.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, yeah, if there is so much, you're absolutely right. There's so much common stuff as well. So, like, just the entire process of like building new features in your SDK is same as, as you would build a new feature in your app. So you get to work with the same IDEs, like you get to work with Xcode and Android Studio. You get to work with the same, kind of resourcing of like strings and images and how you load them. That all remains the same. So if you have app experience, you can totally get started with building mobile SDKs.
Awesome. And what would you say would be some good resources to follow if you're doing SDK development? Again, whether you're beginner level or even if you're experienced for several years and just kind of looking to stay on top of it since technology is always changing. Are there any specific resources out there that have really helped you and your team?
Yeah, I think apart from the official documentation, on Android and developers.android.com and then developers.apple.com, I think they have they have like good instructions on if you're building a library on Android or if you're building a library on iOS, what things to keep in mind. So they have good resources. That's probably the first place I would start. But also, if chances are that if you are an Android developer, and the thing that helped us the most is there are just so many open source libraries out there, especially by Square. Square, the company, they have some really great libraries out there. So, when we started our SDK development, we would look at some of those open source SDKs and how they have structured the SDK, how they have structured their configuration that starts the SDK flow. So that has been a good resource. And then I think Codeco.com, which previously used to be raywonderlic.com, they have some great articles and tutorials on how to write great libraries. So that has helped us a lot as well. So I think and then and I think there are like some other resources, like there are some video tutorials. There are some podcasts that like Fragmented on Android that talks about some really good resources if you're building an SDK. So I think, and then Stack Overflow, of course, has so many. If you look for the right questions, I think that they have a lot of good content as well on how to structure your SDK, for example, or how to protect your SDK from obfuscation and stuff like that. So Stack Overflow also has some really great material out there.
Awesome. That's helpful. Yeah. I mean, I know when it comes to anything, everyone learns differently. And, some people prefer the Stack Overflow style. Some people prefer like YouTube or talks. And so it's always good to have some diversity there in the options for, I think that's kind of what DevRel and like a lot of the space that I work in is all about, is making sure that you have the resources accessible for the community and for developers, but not just in the way you like to learn, in the way that they might like to learn as well. So I think that's helpful
Exactly.
to kind of hear about like the different communities and different places to get involved and kind of resources to follow. So outside of SDK development, are there any other tools or technologies that you're really excited about at the moment? Or it could be related to SDK development, but just, I always like to ask folks that. It's fun because, you know, there's always so much happening in the tech space and it's hard to know like what people are excited about, what to be paying attention to. So that's one of my favorite questions to ask.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I can talk about, you know, just the mobile space in general. I think there's, especially in the last, I guess, like 5 years, I'd say there's been so much rapid development in mobile development. I think like, especially Google, for example, started taking, you know, a stand on, you know, hey, this is how we want you guys to structure your app. So there, like previously, it used to be, you know, there used to be these online communities where you would go to and be like, hey, how do I, you know, pick an architecture on like how do I build my app? There used to be like so many different things, and there used to be Kotlin, for example, when it came out. Before Google officially announced Kotlin, there was a huge community that already wrote the code in Kotlin for Android apps. And there was like a huge support for it, but then Google came out and made it official. So I guess there's just so much rapid development happening at this point. I think the thing that I'm most excited about in both Android and iOS is you know, this style of declarative UI. So you know, Swift UI on iOS and then Jetpack Compose on Android. They both kind of fit this new paradigm of writing UI, where you know, you are just writing less code. You're writing code that's more efficient, and you're not working with archaic systems like XML, that, you know, that was the default on Android for a very long time. But now, you know, things are getting much more composable. Like you can compose a view, you know, all the way down to like a cell or a row that you want to show on the screen. You know, you pass data all the way down, so the data is flowing in a manner that there are no, like, you know, leaks. There used to be so many like leaks just because of the way the data was passed from one screen to another, for example, or from like one view to another on the screen, or, you know, there's just so much happening on how you would handle touches on the screen, you know, how your app handles that. But all of that is changing really rapidly. And I think that's something that I'm most excited about right now, is to see, you know, how Swift UI evolves and how Jetpack Compose evolves, and how much easier it gets to write complex UI code that used to be really difficult before, and used to write like hundreds of lines of this boilerplate code that would just do like this one thing. But now everything is going away, and you can replace that 100 lines of code with like 2 lines of code. So that's something that I guess I'm most excited about in the mobile space.
Yeah, no, that's always good to hear. I mean, I'm not super involved in the mobile space, and so I like having that unique perspective, and having folks on that can talk about it. And it sounds like with anything, I mean, coding and development is, or at least should be, just getting easier and easier based on all these tools that we have out there. But I know that it can also be a little bit overwhelming of like, okay, well, now I have all these options,
Yes.
and what's the best fit for me or for my skill set or for my use case. And so it's always good to hear from experienced folks like yourself of like firsthand of which ones you're focused on or excited about or thinking could make a real change.
Yeah, I think one thing, and that's a really fair concern. You know, if you're a new grad and if you're looking to get into mobile development, there's just so much things out there that it's easy to get overwhelmed. But you know, I'd say the best way to get through that is writing some like demo applications. You know, there are like tons of material available online where you can just pick something. Like you can write, you know, something like an IMDb app. You can write something like a photo gallery app that's like, it's really simple to get started, and then you can test out all these technologies and see for yourself and how do they work. Because no matter how much theory or no matter how much you read about it, unless you do it practically, you won't know, how easy it is or how hard it is, or you won't know the pitfalls. So I'd say that's the best thing that I can do as a developer to be on top of the technologies is, have some of these sample apps, demo apps. It doesn't have to be a crazy, like idea that you have to build an app, but just something that you can run some experiments with. So that's one thing. And then I guess if you're working in a professional environment, if you're working at a company, and like I said, these code bases can be large, they can be really huge to make any changes to. But I think the good thing about technologies like SwiftUI and Jetpack Compose is that it works really well with the legacy systems that are out there. So it doesn't have to be you write your entire in Compose or you get none at all. You can start writing, new features or like new views that you're building in Compose while keeping everything else the way it is, and it will still work. So I guess like taking, one step at a time. I guess that's a really big positive in just the way that the devs at Google and Apple are thinking about bringing these new technologies is that it works with the older stuff out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I like your advice about just start building, just create a demo of some sort, get your hands dirty and just start using these different tools, because that's really the best way. I mean, people can recommend all they want and you can read all you want, but until you really just try it out for yourself, it's going to be hard to know what works for you and what doesn't. So I think that's like one of the best kind of takeaways of a lot of people I talk to is like, you won't know what path, you won't know what area of tech or what kind of developer you want to be until you kind of try these different things. So that's
Exactly.
a good reminder. Awesome. So I know we're kind of running out of time already, which is crazy because I feel like this has flown by, but I was curious, is there anywhere because I know we connected because we're both on the Dev Network board, and I saw that I think you spoke at one of their conference, the Mobile Week conference, not long ago. Is there anywhere else where we can expect to see you coming up, like any other conferences or podcasts at the moment?
No, not at the moment. I do tweet about a lot of these stuff on Twitter. And so if you want to follow some SDK development tips, follow me on Twitter. And I did realize when I started building this SDKs is that there is a lot more help available out there for app developers. But for SDK development, there is stuff, but it's like scattered all over the internet. So I am planning to write a few articles of how to get started with SDK development, and I'll be sure to share that on LinkedIn and Twitter once I have that up as well. Just to get something back to the community, because I've learned a lot from the community, so I just feel like I should do my part and give something back to them as well.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I'll be sure to include links in the description then to your LinkedIn and your Twitter and things like that in case folks want to get in touch, and really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
It was great chatting with you. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Thanks for listening to Select Star, your resource for innovative technology and developer topics. You can find our episodes in all the usual places: Spotify, Apple, Google, RSS, and YouTube. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and share. You can learn more about HarperDB at harperdb.io.